They deleted an entire star system from their own archives, and nobody noticed for a decade. Think about what that means. The most carefully maintained library in the galaxy. Thousands of years of meticulous scholarship, and someone reached inside it, removed every trace of a living, inhabited world, and walked away clean. No alarm, no investigation, no record that the record had ever existed. That is where this story begins. Not with lightsabers, not with the Sith, with a deletion, with the quiet and terrifying realization that the Jedi Order, the institution 10,000 strong that the galaxy trusted with its safety for 10 millennia, had been keeping secrets, not from their enemies, from themselves. Some of those secrets were buried on purpose. Some were buried by accident. Some were so old that the Jedi who buried them had been dead for thousands of years before anyone alive could have thought to ask about them. But here is what makes all of it matter. When you pull every one of these secrets into the same light, when you lay them side by side in the right order for the first time, the Jedi Order you see looks almost nothing like the one the galaxy believed in. It is older, stranger, more brilliant in ways that have never been properly told, and more broken in ways that explain, with a clarity the official story never could, exactly how the greatest Force tradition in galactic history was destroyed in a single night. This is what they buried, and this is why it changes everything. The Jedi Order, as most people understand it, was not the first version of the Jedi Order. That sounds like a small and possibly technical distinction, but it is not. It is perhaps the single most important fact about the entire history of the Order. And it is a fact that the Jedi themselves spent thousands of years actively working to forget. Not a fact that enemies suppressed or that outsiders misrepresented. A fact that the Order buried within its own memory, generation by generation, until it was gone. More than 36,000 years before the fall of the Republic, on a wild and powerful planet at the very heart of the galaxy called Tython, something extraordinary began. 4 groups of beings arrived on that world. They were not brought by conquest or driven by refugee need. They were carried by ancient pyramid-shaped vessels known as tow-your ships, enormous and silent and beautiful, which had traveled to the far corners of the galaxy and gathered people who shared one essential quality. They could feel the Force, not in the vague and instinctive way that many sensitive beings experience it, as a background hum or an occasional intuition or a talent for sensing what others feel, but with a depth and a clarity and an immediacy that set them apart from everyone around them. The Thoyor ships gathered these people from different worlds and different cultures and different traditions and brought them all to Tython. And on that planet, something that had never existed before in the entire history of the galaxy began to take shape. These early settlers were not warriors, not yet. They were philosophers and priests and scholars and wanderers. They came from species and backgrounds that had almost nothing in common except that quality of Force sensitivity, and they brought with them a dozen different understandings of what the Force was and what it meant to live in relationship with it. The debates that unfolded on Tython in those early centuries were extraordinary in their depth and their patience. These people had no template. They were building something from nothing, and they understood that they were. And they took the work with the seriousness it deserved. What they built was an order they called the Jedi. The name itself reflected their core philosophy. It was a compound drawn from two ancient languages spoken among the species that arrived on those first ships, and its meaning pointed toward the idea of a mystic center, of a being or a practice positioned at the equilibrium point of existence. The Jedi understood the Force as having two fundamental expressions that they named after Tython's twin moons. The light side they called Ashla, the dark side they called Bogan, and for the Jedi, both of these expressions were not merely real, but sacred. Both were necessary. The point was never to choose one over the other. The entire purpose of the Jedi tradition was to hold them together in a balance that mirrored the balance of the cosmos itself. This was not a casual philosophy or a poorly considered compromise between two factions who could not agree. The Jedi thought with extraordinary depth and seriousness about what it meant to walk in balance, about what that balance demanded from an individual and from a community, about the dangers that came from tipping too far in either direction. They built temples across the surface of Tython, dedicated to different aspects of Force study, and they sent students between those temples throughout their training to ensure that no practitioner developed too narrow or too exclusive a relationship with the Force. If a student moved too deeply into the light, becoming so serene and harmonious that they lost contact with the passion and the drive and the transformative energy that the dark side represented, they were sent to meditate on Tython's dark moon, Bogan, to find their fire again. If a student fell too far into darkness, consumed by intensity and ambition and the raw pull of power, they were sent to the bright moon, Ashla, to find stillness. The balance was always moving. The point was to keep it moving, to never allow it to settle permanently on one side. Tython itself appeared to respond to how well the Jedi maintained this equilibrium. When the Force was in balance on the planet, the ecosystem was stable and extraordinary in its beauty. When it fell out of balance, Tython reacted with storms and earthquakes and ecological violence that could destroy temples and scatter communities and make the landscape itself hostile to habitation. The planet was alive to the Force in ways that most worlds were not, and it was unforgiving of imbalance in a way that made the Jedi uniquely and personally aware of the cost of getting it wrong. This was not an abstract principle for them. It was a physical reality they lived with every day. Lose your balance, and the world around you suffers for it. The lesson was immediate and undeniable. For thousands of years, the Jedi flourished. They built a civilization of considerable depth and sophistication, developing an understanding of the Force that drew on both its light and dark aspects with equal seriousness and equal study. They had their conflicts, as any community does. Individual members fell too far in one direction or another and caused difficulty. Philosophical disagreements produced lasting tensions that required careful navigation. But as an institution, across millennia of continuous practice, the Jedi maintained their philosophy with remarkable consistency. The balance was the thing. It was always the thing. And then came the Force Wars. Around 25,800 years before the Battle of Yavin, the internal tensions that had been accumulating for generations finally broke through the surface entirely. A faction of Jedi who had moved deeply and perhaps irrevocably into the dark side of the Force came into direct and catastrophic conflict with those who had leaned fully into the light. The exact cause of that initial rupture is lost to history, as so many exact causes are when you look back across tens of thousands of years. What the records that survived preserve is the aftermath. The Force Wars of Tython were devastating. Jedi fought Jedi across the surface of the planet with the full depth of their Force abilities deployed against one another. Tython responded to this shattering imbalance with violence of its own. Storms tore across continents. The surface of the planet cracked and shifted. The temples that had been built across thousands of years were damaged or destroyed. The civilization the Jedi had spent millennia building suffered wounds that would take generations to even partially repair. The dark side faction was defeated. The light side adherents prevailed. And here is where the secret begins. The victorious faction, in the immediate aftermath of the war, made a decision that they understood and presented as a rational and necessary response to what had just happened. They decided that the policy of balance had failed. They concluded that the attempt to honor both Ashla and Bogan, to walk the center path and regard both aspects of the Force as sacred and necessary, had ultimately produced exactly the division and conflict they had been trying to prevent. The proof, they told themselves, was what they had just survived. Balance had not saved them. Balance had not stopped the darkness from growing into a faction capable of destroying everything they had built. Therefore, balance was not the answer. The answer was to reject the dark side entirely. They simplified their name, dropping letters, becoming simply the Jedi. They rewrote their founding philosophy to exclude Bogan as a worthy aspect of Force engagement, recasting it not as a sacred and necessary counterpart to Ashla, but as a corrupting influence to be resisted at all costs. They built a new framework for Force practice that placed serenity and peace and harmony at its center and treated passion and ambition and raw emotion as warning signals of approaching danger. They looked back at their Jedi history, and they edited it. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic act of deliberate erasure, gradually, across generations. As the teachers who still remembered and honored the old ways grew old and died, and as the students who replaced them had grown up entirely within the new framework and had no living memory of anything that came before it. Within a few centuries of the Force Wars, the specific philosophical content of the Jedi tradition was no longer being actively taught. Within a millennium, it was the province of historians and scholars rather than practitioners. Within several thousand years, the vast majority of Jedi had no meaningful understanding that their order had ever been anything other than what it currently was, that the light side only framework they practiced had been deliberately chosen rather than always having been the truth, that the people who founded their tradition had believed something fundamentally different about the Force, and had considered that something to be not dangerous heresy, but genuine wisdom. The ancient philosophy of balance, the serious and carefully considered conviction that both Ashla and Bogan were necessary and sacred aspects of a complete understanding of the Force, had been replaced with an institutional memory that dismissed Bogan entirely and presented the Jedi tradition, when it was mentioned at all, as a primitive and philosophically incomplete precursor to the true Jedi way. But the burying of that history did not bury its consequences, because the Jedi had understood something real. Not everything they had believed, not every aspect of their practice, but something fundamental and true. The Force did have two aspects. Both of those aspects were real. Both were present, in some form, in every Force-sensitive being who ever lived, in every Jedi who ever trained in the temple on Coruscant or meditated in the gardens of Ossus. And when you build an entire philosophy, and an entire institution on the premise that one of those aspects is simply wrong, simply dangerous, simply to be suppressed and rejected and treated as enemy territory within the self, you create a pressure that does not disappear because you refuse to name it. You create it in every student who finds within themselves impulses the Order has taught them are warning signs of darkness. You create Jedi who cannot examine their own shadows honestly because the framework they live and breathe has no language for doing so that does not immediately become a language of self-condemnation and fear. You create an order that is perpetually surprised when its members fall because the story the institution tells about itself does not make room for the reality that falling is not an aberration, but an ever-present possibility that requires honest engagement rather than avoidance. The Jedi who emerged from the Force Wars were not wicked people. They were people who had survived something terrible and drawn an understandable but ultimately catastrophic lesson from it. The dark side adherents had won battles during the Force Wars not because balance was a failed philosophy, but because they had committed to their approach with greater ferocity and perhaps greater honesty about what they were doing than the light side adherents had matched. The lesson the survivors institutionalized was that the dark side must be rejected utterly. The lesson they did not take, the one that would have served them across the long span of time that followed, was that you cannot defeat something you refuse to understand, and you cannot truly understand something you have taught yourself to treat only as an enemy. The Jedi had understood both sides. The Jedi, who came after them, understood only one. And that missing half of their original wisdom became the fault line that ran beneath the entire history of everything that followed, invisible and unacknowledged, until one by one the cracks that opened from it became too wide to hold together. The Jedi buried their own beginning and replaced it with a cleaner story. And in doing so, they cut themselves off from the most honest and most complete understanding of the Force that any tradition in galactic history had ever achieved. Beneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, there was a room that most members of the Order never knew existed. Not a metaphor or a figure of speech. An actual room, a physical space within the vast underground architecture of the temple, accessible only through pathways that required multiple levels of clearance and a knowledge of navigational protocols that did not appear in any document available to a standard member of the Order. The Jedi called it the Restricted Archives, and it held the things the Order had decided were too dangerous or too disturbing or too inconvenient to be stored in the main library where any Padawan with basic access could wander in and begin reading. The existence of the Restricted Archives was not itself a closely guarded secret in the way certain other things were. Senior Jedi knew about it. Members of the High Council knew about it. The chief librarians and archivists knew about it because they were the ones responsible for maintaining it and determining what went into it and under what circumstances it could be accessed. But the contents of that vault, the specific question of what was actually stored there and precisely why, and far more significantly the question of what had been stored there at various points in history and then subsequently removed or altered or destroyed, that was a considerably more carefully managed matter. The chief archivist of the Jedi Temple during the final decades of the Republic was a master named Jocasta Nu. She was brilliant in the particular way that comes from a lifetime of total devotion to a single discipline, meticulous and deeply learned, and absolutely committed to the preservation of knowledge as a practice that was itself a form of service to the Force. She had spent her career building and maintaining what she understood to be the most complete repository of information in the galaxy, and she believed in that completeness with the kind of confidence that only comes from not yet having encountered a meaningful challenge to it. When Obi-Wan Kenobi came to her during his investigation into the saber dart that had nearly killed Senator Padme Amidala on Coruscant, unable to locate the star system he was searching for in the standard archives, Jocasta Nu told him with complete and apparently sincere certainty that if an item did not appear in the Jedi archives, it did not exist. She was not being dismissive or evasive or politically careful. She genuinely believed this. She had built her professional life and her sense of purpose around the comprehensiveness of what she maintained. And she had no particular reason to doubt it, because she had never encountered a significant gap in it, or so she thought. She was wrong. And the wrongness was not accidental. The star system Obi-Wan was looking for was called Camino. It was a watery planet in the Outer Rim, home to a species of extraordinarily skilled cloners who had been working for approximately a decade on a project of almost incomprehensible scale and secrecy. A clone army. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers grown from a single genetic template, all of them identical to a Mandalorian bounty hunter named Jango Fett, all of them engineered for military purpose with behavioral modifications built in at the cellular level. This army had been commissioned in the name of the Jedi Order. It had been paid for with resources traceable, if anyone traced them carefully enough, back to channels connected to the Republic itself. It existed, physically and undeniably, and had been in active development for years, and not a single reference to it existed anywhere in the Jedi archives, because someone had deleted it. The erasure of Camino from the Jedi archives is among the most troubling single events in the internal history of the Order, and it received considerably less sustained attention than its full implications deserved. The reason is partly circumstantial. By the time the implications began to become clear, the Clone Wars had already begun, and the Order had no institutional capacity to conduct internal investigations about archival irregularities while simultaneously running a galactic military campaign. By the time the war ended, the Order was gone. The investigation that should have happened never did. The question of who had reached into the most carefully maintained information repository in the galaxy, located the records for an entire inhabited star system with active diplomatic and commercial relationships, and removed them so completely that the archivist herself had no knowledge they had ever existed. That question went permanently unanswered. But the question itself matters. Think about what it actually means. The Jedi archives were not casually maintained or carelessly organized. They were the product of thousands of years of meticulous scholarship, continuously updated and verified, and cross-referenced by trained archivists who understood both the scope of what they held and the importance of keeping it accurate. To successfully delete Camino from those records required not just access, but a knowledge of how the archive was structured and verified, a knowledge of which cross-references and relational entries would need to be removed along with the primary record to ensure the deletion appeared complete rather than simply absent. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. They had thought it through. They had covered their tracks with the kind of thoroughness that does not come from a hurried or impulsive act. And if they could do it to Camino, they could do it to anything else. This is the thought that should have stopped everything. that should have triggered a comprehensive audit of everything the archives contained against every external record available, that should have produced a systematic attempt to determine the boundaries of what had been changed and when and by whom. It did not produce that, because events moved too fast and priorities shifted, and then the order was gone. But the logical conclusion remains. If the archive could be edited without triggering detection, then no Jedi who ever used those archives could be entirely confident that what they found there was complete. The chief archivist was certain the records were comprehensive. She had built her certainty on the premise that any significant absence would have registered as an absence. But a successful deletion does not register as an absence. It registers as never having been there at all, which means that for everything the Order knew about the galaxy and about itself, there was an unknown quantity of things they had once known and no longer did, not because those things had been locked in the restricted section, but because they had been made to disappear entirely. The restricted archives themselves operated on a different principle than outright deletion. Things were placed there not to be erased, but to be controlled, to be made available only to those the Council determined were ready for them or needed them. Ancient Sith texts and artifacts that carried real danger if studied without proper preparation. Records of dark side techniques and rituals, preserved not for instruction but as historical documentation of what Force users had done when they moved fully away from the light. Detailed accounts of specific Jedi who had fallen and the precise circumstances of those falls, which the Council occasionally reviewed in their private deliberations when trying to understand a contemporary member who appeared to be at risk. There were also things in the restricted archives that were simply uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with active danger. Records of Jedi missions that had gone badly in ways the Order preferred not to publicize. Documentation of High Council decisions that were controversial or ethically questionable even by the standards of their own time. Evidence of the gap between the Jedi's public presentation of themselves as selfless and impartial guardians of peace and the actual political calculations and institutional self-interest that shaped their day-to-day relationship with the Republic. The Jedi were not hypocrites in any simple or conscious sense. They were an institution. And institutions of sufficient age and complexity accumulate records that reveal the distance between what they say they stand for and what they actually do. And not all of those records need to be available to every student who arrives at the temple at the age of 5 and begins training in an environment carefully structured to produce a particular understanding of what the Order is. What this created was a situation in which the Jedi Order maintained two entirely parallel bodies of knowledge about itself and the galaxy. The public archive, vast and genuinely impressive, representing accumulated learning across enormous spans of time, and the restricted archive, smaller but in many ways more honest, holding the things the Order knew but had collectively decided should not circulate freely. Every senior Jedi who made regular use of the restricted section understood this division implicitly. Knowledge existed in tiers. Your access to the higher tiers depended not just on your rank, but on the Council's assessment of your readiness, your stability, your judgment, your ability to encounter difficult information without being destabilized by it. The younger members of the Order, the Padawans, and the newly knighted, operated with an understanding of both the Force and the institution, shaped almost entirely by the public archive and the approved curriculum. They learned the version that had been approved for their stage of development. The clean version. The version in which the Jedi philosophy was a philosophically incomplete precursor to what the Jedi had become. in which every significant conflict in Jedi history had ended with the Order's wisdom ultimately prevailing, in which the Council's major decisions across history had been consistently well-intentioned and generally wise. The senior members who had spent years working in the restricted archives knew a considerably more complicated picture. They knew about the specific mistakes and the institutional compromises and the things that had been deliberately removed from the accessible record. And none of them, not the most senior members, not the longest-serving counselors, knew exactly what had been removed before their time. Because the nature of a successful deletion is that you cannot see what is no longer there. The archive was the memory of the Order, and like all memory, it was not a record of what had actually happened. It was a record of what the Order had chosen to remember, shaped by the decisions of people who were themselves operating within the limits of what they knew and what they believed and what they were willing to preserve. In the long history of the Jedi Order, many thousands of members had left. Initiates who were sent away because they began force training too late or showed insufficient connection to sustain the demands of the path. Padawans who could not complete their trials or who discovered in the process of attempting them that the life of a Jedi was not the life they were meant for. Knights who broke their vows, who fell to the dark side, who walked away for reasons their records described in the official language of institutional disappointment. These departures were part of the texture of the Order's existence, unremarkable in individual cases, noted in administrative records, and then set aside because there were always new students arriving at the temple, and the work of training them did not pause for any single departure. But there was a different category, a smaller and far more significant group whose exits were preserved, not merely in administrative notation, but in a specific collection of portraits maintained within the temple itself, displayed together in a location that any member who passed through certain corridors would encounter. These were the Jedi Masters, the most experienced and accomplished members the Order produced, who had chosen voluntarily to leave. Not because they had fallen to the dark side, not because they had committed violations that required their removal, not because they had failed by any measure the Order formally recognized, but simply because they had thought carefully and honestly about the life they were living and reached the conclusion that they could not continue to live it within the Order. Across the entire history of the institution, there had been 20 of them, 20 masters who had left by choice, 20 portraits on a wall, each face preserved at approximately the moment of departure, looking out at the generations of students who walked past them. They were called the Lost 20, and the name was given in something closer to quiet sorrow than condemnation. They were not considered villains. They had not been expelled. They had not done the kinds of things that brought shame on the Order's name. They had simply determined that remaining was no longer possible for them, and they had left, and their absence said something about the Order that the Order preferred not to examine too closely. The stories of the individual members of the Lost 20 are mostly fragmentary in the surviving record, and the specific character of that fragmentation is itself revealing. What survives tends to be the administrative facts, names, dates of departure, formal designations of rank at the time of leaving, the official rationale offered if any official rationale was provided. What does not survive in any meaningful depth is the actual content of the decisions these people made, the conversations they had with colleagues and students in the period leading up to their departure, the specific things they had come to believe about the Order and about the Force, and about the relationship between the two that made remaining untenable for them. Those things are almost entirely absent from the historical record. And the absence has the quality of an institution that has decided not to preserve evidence that might require it to take its own critics seriously. What can be traced, in the cases where enough survives to construct any coherent narrative, is a pattern that recurs across different periods and different individual circumstances. The masters who left were not, as a rule, people who had developed secretly dangerous ambitions or been quietly corrupted by the dark side over years of hidden practice. They were not proto-Sith looking for a justification to stop pretending they belonged in the Order. They were people who had reached a point of honest and clear-eyed assessment of the contradictions within the institution and had concluded that they could not resolve those contradictions from within, that remaining required a kind of self-deception they were no longer able to sustain. The most famous of the 20, and certainly the most recent in the final era of the Republic, was a man named Dooku. Before that name became synonymous with the movement that nearly destroyed everything, it belonged to someone else entirely. It belonged to one of the finest Jedi the Order had produced in living memory, a master of extraordinary ability and considerable depth, a student of Yoda himself, a teacher who had trained one of the most gifted knights of his generation. He had held his rank for decades and earned it through both power and wisdom. He had been offered a seat on the High Council and had accepted it, which meant the Order's most senior leadership had judged him worthy of their highest collective trust. And then he looked at something he could not unsee, and he left. He was added to the wall of the Lost 20, and his portrait was placed alongside the others. And the face in that portrait was the face his colleagues and students had known throughout his career. Not angry, not dramatic, simply present. Those who had known him and who saw it said it looked exactly like him, which made it harder in some ways than if it had been unfamiliar. Dooku left because he had arrived at several conclusions that the Order would not hear. He believed the Republic had become corrupt in ways that went far beyond ordinary political dysfunction, that the Senate had long since ceased to be a body that served the principles of justice and democracy, and had become an instrument of wealth and influence and self-perpetuating power. He believed the Jedi Order's alliance with that republic, their position as its formal servants and guardians, had compromised their ability to fulfill what he understood as their actual purpose. He believed the Order had grown increasingly insular and bureaucratic and institutionally cautious in ways that were making them progressively less capable of genuine moral agency at exactly the moment when the galaxy most needed people with the courage to act on actual principle rather than institutional alignment. He believed the High Council had become a body that prioritized its own continuity and its relationship with Republic authority over the harder and more important work of honest ethical judgment. He was not wrong about most of this. That is the fact that sits uncomfortably at the center of the story of Dooku and the Lost 20. His diagnosis of the problems was, in many respects, accurate. The Senate was corrupt in precisely the ways he described. The Jedi's uncritical alliance with it had created dependencies and compromises that limited their independence. The Order was becoming more focused on institutional self-preservation than on the principles it claimed to embody. The Council made decisions that reflected political calculation as often as pure wisdom. None of this was secret to the senior members who had been inside the institution long enough to see it clearly. Where Dooku went catastrophically wrong was in his response. He found Darth Sidious. He allowed himself to become the instrument of a darkness far worse than any of the problems he had correctly identified. and the war that followed consumed millions of lives and very nearly ended everything the Republic had built across thousands of years. The fact that his response was a catastrophe does not mean his assessment of the problems was simply a rationalization constructed by a man already in the grip of darkness. He saw real things. He named real failures. And the Order's response was to add his portrait to the wall and treat his departure as evidence of individual failure rather than as an honest report about institutional problems that might be worth genuinely addressing. The other 19 members of the Lost 20 told similar stories in different registers across different historical moments. A master who had spent her career trying to reconcile the Order's prohibition against deep attachment with her genuine and carefully considered conviction that love in its fullest sense was not opposed to the Force, but was in fact one of its most direct expressions, and who could not in the end continue teaching students to suppress something she had come to believe they needed. A scholar who had spent 30 years studying the Jedi tradition in the restricted archives and had become convinced that the Jedi's rejection of Bogan after the Force Wars was a philosophical error of the First Order, that the middle path the original practitioners had walked was not a failed experiment, but a truer and more complete way of engaging the Force, and who could not, in good conscience, continue teaching a framework he understood to be missing half of the truth. A warrior who had fought in too many conflicts on behalf of a republic he no longer trusted, who could no longer stand before young Padawans and present the life of a Jedi military commander as an expression of genuine service to justice without feeling that he was lying to them in some fundamental way. Each of them had thought carefully before arriving at their decision. The standard required to achieve the rank of master within the Order was not merely a matter of power or accumulated years. It required demonstrated wisdom and judgment of the highest caliber available to the institution. These 20 people had all met that standard before they reached whatever crisis made remaining impossible. Their departures were therefore the departures of people who were fully equipped to understand what they were doing and why. The Order preserved their faces. It did not, in any systematic or honest way, preserve their arguments or engage seriously with the reasons they gave for leaving. The portraits were a form of acknowledgement that stopped carefully short of accountability. "We know you left," the wall said. "We have not forgotten you. We will not ask too closely why." And the cost of that silence accumulated in the way all institutional silence accumulates, in a steady deepening of the blindness that comes from refusing to hear the most honest assessments offered by the people best positioned to make them. There was a prophecy. The Jedi spoke of it across 1,000 years, passing it from teacher to student, with a reverence that stood in curious proportion to how little anyone actually understood about what it said, or where it had come from, or what it was truly pointing toward. They called it the prophecy of the Chosen One. It said that one would come who would bring balance to the Force. It was ancient, and it was vague, and it was treated with the kind of weight that major institutions give to foundational narratives, a weight that often grows heavier the longer something has been believed, rather than in response to new evidence that confirms its truth. The story most people know begins with Qui-Gon Jinn arriving before the High Council, with a young boy from Tatooine named Anakin Skywalker telling them that this child had the highest midichlorian count ever recorded in any Jedi's experience, that his mother could offer no explanation for his birth, that every instinct Qui-Gon possessed told him this was the fulfillment of what the ancient prophecy had been pointing toward. The council was skeptical. Yoda was deeply concerned. Mace Windu expressed reservations with the careful language of a man who could not afford to be seen as dismissing something the Order had been waiting for across a millennium. But eventually, after Qui-Gon died on Naboo, they relented and allowed the training to proceed. And what followed is known. What is less known, and considerably more interesting, is everything the official version of that story leaves out. It leaves out where the prophecy actually came from, and how old it truly was, and what tradition had originally produced it, and what it said in its oldest recoverable form. It leaves out the specific nature of the doubts that multiple members of the High Council held privately about whether their interpretation of the prophecy was correct, doubts they shared with almost no one. Because expressing uncertainty about a foundational belief in an institutional context carries costs that most people, even wise and accomplished masters, would rather not pay. And it leaves out what eventually became unmistakably clear, which is that even granting the identification of Anakin Skywalker as the Chosen One as entirely correct, the Jedi had been wrong for a very long time about what bringing balance to the Force actually meant. The prophecy predated the current form of the Jedi Order by a margin that should have given every scholar who studied it serious pause. Its origins lay in texts that were old even by Jedi standards, written within a tradition that drew on the Jedi philosophy of balance, the very philosophy the Order had suppressed and buried and replaced with its own light side dominant framework. This was not coincidental. The prophecy of the Chosen One makes considerably more sense within the context of the Jedi understanding of the Force than it does within the context of the Jedi framework that came after the Force Wars. To the Jedi, balance meant exactly what the word implies in the most literal reading: an equilibrium, a proper relationship between two necessary aspects of a single reality, not the triumph of one over the other, not the permanent defeat of one by the other. Actual balance, held in careful and ongoing relationship. When the Jedi inherited this ancient text, they read it through the only lens they had, which was their own philosophical framework. A framework in which the light side was the correct and desirable expression of the Force, and the dark side was a corruption and a danger. And so, when they encountered the phrase "bring balance to the Force," they translated it through that lens into language they could integrate with what they already believed. Bringing balance meant correcting an imbalance, and the imbalance, from their perspective, was the presence and activity of the Sith. The dark side had become too powerful and too active through the existence of the Sith Order, and the Chosen One would come and address that imbalance by defeating them. This interpretation was not irrational. It was coherent within the framework the Jedi used. Given their philosophy and the historical reality of the Sith as a genuine and recurring threat, connecting the prophecy to the defeat of that threat made a certain logical sense. But it was reading the ancient text through a lens rather than reading the text itself. And the lens had been ground to its specific shape by thousands of years of institutional choices that traced back to the Force Wars, back to the decision to reject Bogan, back to the original secret about the Jedi tradition that the Order had buried in its own memory before anyone then living had been born. Yoda knew the interpretation was uncertain. The surviving record of his private thoughts and communications over his 9 centuries of life suggests a relationship with the prophecy considerably more complicated and humble than the public face of council deliberation ever showed. He had genuine doubts about whether any individual could be reliably identified as the chosen one on the basis of midichlorian count and unusual birth circumstances, however extraordinary those circumstances were. He had doubts about whether the prophecy was pointing toward what they expected it to point toward, or whether it was pointing towards something the Order had not yet imagined. He had lived long enough, seen enough institutional certainties fail, and enough unexpected things emerge from unexpected directions to know that prophecies had a way of fulfilling themselves in forms that confounded every expectation of everyone who had spent generations preparing for their arrival. Mace Windu shared some of these doubts, though his expressed more as specific concern about the particular individual than about the nature of the prophecy itself. Windu was a practitioner of an approach to the Force that the Order had allowed primarily because of Windu's extraordinary skill and discipline, and because its specific application was clearly serving the light side. The style he had developed and mastered, called Varpad, worked by channeling the practitioner's own inner darkness and capacity for aggression into controlled expression in combat. It walked closer to the dark side than any other approach the Order officially sanctioned. And perhaps because of years of working deliberately with his own darkness in a controlled context, Windu understood the pull of the dark side in a way that most of his colleagues did not, and he was therefore more honestly worried about Anakin Skywalker than the framework of the prophecy made it comfortable to be, because the prophecy created a pressure that had its own kind of distorting effect. Once the identification was made, once the narrative was accepted that this boy was the fulfillment of something the Order had been waiting for across 1,000 years, the shape of that narrative started to influence how every member of the Order who knew about it interacted with Anakin Skywalker. They made exceptions for him that they would not have made for other students. They tolerated attitudes and behaviors that would have led to the reassignment or early dismissal of other Padawans. They could not be fully honest with him about his flaws, because their investment in the narrative of his ultimate destiny made honest assessment feel like a risk they could not afford to take. The prophecy was, in its way, a trap. Not for Anakin alone, but for the entire institution that had built its expectation of him around a text it did not fully understand. It gave the Order a story too compelling to resist, and too useful to interrogate carefully, a narrative that seemed to explain why this extraordinary and difficult child had appeared among them, and what his presence ultimately meant. They committed to that story early and thoroughly, and then found themselves unable to revisit it with genuine honesty when the evidence that something had gone seriously wrong with their expectations began to accumulate. What the Council does not appear to have seriously considered at any point during the decades of Anakin Skywalker's training was the possibility that the prophecy was precisely correct and their interpretation of it was not. That the identification of Anakin as the Chosen One was accurate in every important sense, but that the bringing of balance the ancient text described was not the permanent defeat of the dark side that the Jedi expected. That balance, in the meaning the Jedi original text intended, was an actual equilibrium. Light and dark in proper relationship with each other, neither dominant, neither erased. The way the Force had been before the Force Wars had shattered the first tradition that understood it. The way the oldest and most honest practitioners of Force engagement had believed it was always meant to be. If that was what the prophecy had always been saying, then Anakin Skywalker fulfilled it completely. He was trained by the Jedi. He fell to the dark side and served the Emperor. He killed his own master and saved his son and destroyed the Sith at the cost of his own life. And in the end, The balance he brought was not the triumphant, permanent victory of the light, but something more complicated and more true to the actual nature of the Force. Not one side winning, something continuing, something restored to the possibility of both. The prophecy was true. The Jedi simply did not understand what it was saying, and 1,000 years of certainty about their reading of it had made it nearly impossible to consider the possibility that they had read it wrong from the beginning. Death is not the end. The Jedi understood this in principle. They said it with genuine conviction at funerals, when senior members fell in battle, when students were grappling with losses too large to quickly absorb. The Force remains. The individual dissolves back into the living force from which all things emerged. What seems like death is a transition rather than a termination. They said this calmly and clearly, and with every appearance of confident belief, and most of them meant it completely. What the Jedi did not tell their students, because the great majority of them did not actually know it themselves, was that there was a way to survive that dissolution. A technique of extraordinary rarity and depth, so poorly preserved in the institutional tradition by the final centuries of the Republic that perhaps a handful of living beings had any meaningful knowledge of it. A way to maintain individual consciousness after the body was gone. To preserve identity and awareness within the Force. To remain present in some form, communicable and recognizable, and in the most essential sense, still oneself, even after death. Not as something frightening or unnatural, but as what the Jedi tradition would eventually learn to call a Force ghost, a luminous and coherent presence within the living Force that retained the ability to speak and to think and to offer guidance to those still living. The knowledge of Force immortality was ancient in ways that made even the deep history of the Jedi Order look recent. It originated in a tradition so old that the historical records available to the Jedi were fragmentary and incomplete in ways that made full reconstruction impossible. The beings known as the Shaman of the Wills had possessed some version of it, or something close enough to it that the distinction between their understanding and the full technique was a matter of degree rather than of kind. The Wills were among the most mysterious figures in the history of Force engagement. Beings who existed at a point of intersection between the ordinary mortal experience and something that had no simple name. Beings who had oriented their entire existence around studying the deepest and most fundamental aspects of what the Force was and what it was capable of across the full scope of its nature. They had understood far earlier than the Jedi, and through methods the Jedi had not developed, that consciousness and identity were not simply products of the physical organism, that the Force which animated all living things also carried within itself the potential to preserve certain kinds of awareness, even after the material form that had housed that awareness was gone. But this understanding had not passed cleanly into the Jedi tradition. The Order had developed in a direction that emphasized active service, practical application of Force ability in the living world, the engagement with present problems and immediate threats, the deep metaphysical questions, the ones about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between awareness and physical existence, and what actually persisted beyond death and in what form, were treated as matters for personal meditation and philosophical reflection rather than as practical subjects with transferable techniques and teachable skills. The Jedi spent enormous collective resources developing the ability to move objects with the Force and to perceive the intentions of others and to foresee the contours of the future. They spent comparatively little on the question of what happened after death and whether anything could be done about it, because the official answer was that death was to be accepted and that the Force would do what the Force would do, and the appropriate response of a Jedi was peaceful surrender to that process. The result was that the ability to survive death with identity intact had effectively slipped out of the mainstream Jedi tradition a very long time before the fall of the Republic. Not completely and not irrecoverably. It existed in fragments, in hints preserved in texts in the restricted archives, in traditions maintained by communities at the edges of Force practice that had not fully merged their knowledge with the institutional Jedi, in the deep and private studies of individuals who had pushed far enough into their own engagement with the Force to reach the edges of what the official curriculum acknowledged. But it did not exist as a teachable practice within the Order. It did not exist as something any master could pass to a student through the normal channels of Jedi education. It existed as a rumor of a possibility, as something the oldest texts occasionally pointed toward, without providing the actual content of how it was done. It was rediscovered, or rather, it was rescued through a path so unusual that it could easily have not happened, could easily have remained lost for however long the Order continued to exist, and then disappeared entirely when the Order fell. The person who rescued it was a Jedi Master named Qui-Gon Jinn, and the story of how he came to know what he knew is as quiet and unconventional as everything else about his career. Qui-Gon Jinn was not a typical Jedi Master. This was something his colleagues acknowledged with varying mixtures of genuine respect, genuine exasperation, and the complicated affection that attaches to people who are at once admirable and difficult. He was deeply powerful and deeply principled and utterly committed to his own reading of what the Force was and what it required of him in ways that the institution around him sometimes found inconvenient. He had declined a seat on the High Council multiple times across a career of considerable distinction, a choice so unusual within the culture of the Order that most people who encountered it simply assumed he must have had reasons that would eventually become clear, because turning down that kind of recognition without a clear reason was not something a person did unless something more important to them than recognition was at stake. He followed what he described, in his own terms, as the living Force, a philosophy that placed the immediate and present reality of the Force at the center of practice, rather than the abstract principles and long-range considerations that dominated council-level Jedi thinking. Pay attention to what is happening right now. Let the Force guide moment to moment. Trust the living things immediately around you as the most reliable indicators of what the Force is doing and what it needs. This philosophy led him consistently toward the margins of Jedi practice, toward the edges of what the approved curriculum covered, toward encounters with traditions and communities that existed in relationship to the Force without being formally part of the Order. Through these engagements, across decades of a career that his colleagues generally considered idiosyncratic but difficult to fault in its results, Qui-Gon encountered people who carried fragments of the Shaman of the Wills tradition, not in any direct or formal sense. The Wills themselves were not accessible as a living teaching community by the time of the late Republic, but the knowledge they had carried, or pieces of it, had persisted in other forms, in isolated practitioners and ancient communities and carefully preserved texts that most Jedi would never have thought to seek out or taken seriously if they had stumbled across them accidentally. Through these encounters, Qui-Gon began to understand what the Jedi tradition and the Shaman of the Wills had both approached from different angles. That individual consciousness and the Force were not simply in a relationship where the Force received a person's consciousness at death and dissolved it into the whole, that under specific conditions, achieved through specific practice, a consciousness sufficiently developed and sufficiently grounded in its connection to the Force could maintain coherence within the living Force even after the physical body was gone. Not as a trapped or suffering thing, not as something incomplete or unnatural, as a genuine continuation, different in its mode from physical existence, but real in its own terms. He studied this. He developed a method, not complete and not identical to any single prior tradition, but functional and grounded in his own deep understanding of the Force's nature. He knew, in the final years of his life, that what he had been working toward was real and achievable, and that he intended to bring it back into the Jedi tradition properly, to teach it, to share it, to rebuild within the Order the connection to one of the deepest and most significant capabilities the Force had ever offered to those sensitive enough to develop it. And then he died on Naboo, killed by a Sith warrior in the underground generator complex of the planet's capital city, before he had completed the transmission of what he knew to anyone within the Order. The knowledge did not die with him entirely. That is the part of the story that matters most. Qui-Gon had not entirely abandoned the possibility of continued practice, even beyond physical death. And because the technique he had spent years recovering was in some fundamental sense about exactly this, about persistence beyond the end of the body, he retained the capacity to continue reaching across the boundary after his death in the most limited and fragmentary way. He could not appear. He had not completed the training that would have allowed full manifestation as a coherent, visible presence. But he could be heard by those who were attuned to listen in the right way, in the right state of quiet and receptivity. His voice remained present within the Force. Yoda heard him. In the long years of his exile on Dagobah, the ancient master undertook his own deep and rigorous study of what Qui-Gon had begun to recover. The being who had spent 900 years at the center of the Jedi Order, who had trained generations of its finest members, who had watched the institution rise to its greatest heights and then burn, used his time in exile to learn something the Order had lost so long before that most of its members had not even known it was something that could be learned. He learned to reach across the boundary. He learned to hear the voices of those who had gone before. He learned, over years of sustained and solitary practice, in a place where the Force ran strange and strong and undiluted by the noise of the institutional world he had left behind, how to develop and eventually to transmit the technique in a form that could be passed to others. Obi-Wan Kenobi received it as well, during his own years in exile on Tatooine. What passed between him and Yoda across the distance of their separate solitudes is not fully documented, but the result is visible in everything that followed. Obi-Wan died on a Death Star and returned as a presence that could be seen and heard and encountered. He spoke to Luke Skywalker in the cold of Hoth. He appeared in the swamps of Dagobah. He stood in the light on Endor. What Qui-Gon had found in the margins of a career spent at the edges of Jedi practice, what Yoda had rebuilt in solitude over years of exile, had been passed into another generation. The mainstream Jedi Order, at the absolute height of its power, with 10,000 members and archives stretching back across tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, had not been able to do what one unconventional master did in the spaces outside the approved curriculum, because the Order had stopped looking. It had organized its collective knowledge and its institutional priorities around the things it had decided were worth knowing and worth teaching, and the deepest available question about what the Force was, and what it could preserve across the boundary of death had fallen so far outside those categories that most Jedi did not even know it was a question worth asking. They had an answer. The answer was that death was to be accepted. The Force would handle it. The appropriate response was peaceful surrender. This was the approved answer. And approved answers do not generate continued searching. The secret of Force immortality was not hidden from the Jedi in any dramatic sense. It was not locked behind additional doors within the restricted archives or struck from the record in an act of deliberate suppression. It had simply been allowed to drift from the center to the edges, and then from the edges out of reach entirely, the way things are lost when an institution grows large enough that the periphery of its knowledge becomes invisible from the center, when the map everyone uses becomes so comprehensive and so authoritative in appearance that the idea of its incompleteness stops occurring to people who should be asking about it. What Qui-Gon found in those margins, Yoda rebuilt in exile, and what Obi-Wan carried into the next generation was something the ancient wills had known and the Jedi had intuited, and the Jedi, in their long centuries of institutional settling, had allowed to quietly slip away. The Force was not merely an energy field to be used by the living and surrendered at death. It was a medium of continuity in which certain kinds of awareness could persist, in which identity could remain anchored beyond the dissolution of the body, in which the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than the approved curriculum acknowledged. That knowledge had been waiting in the margins of the tradition for a very long time. It was found by someone willing to look in the right places. But it was found too late to change what happened to the order that had forgotten it. There are places in the galaxy where the Force does not behave like itself. Not places where the Force is absent, which is a different category of strangeness entirely, but places where it is too present, where it is so concentrated and so active and so saturated into the fabric of the physical environment that the ordinary rules by which Force-sensitive beings understand and navigate their relationship with it no longer apply with any reliability. The Jedi had a term for these places. They called them vergences, concentrations of Force energy so intense that they bent the nature of reality around them, producing effects that had no clean explanation in any of the standard frameworks the Order used to teach about the Force. In a vergence, visions came without warning or invitation. Time lost its reliable direction. The boundary between what was and what might be and what had once been became permeable in ways that made the normally careful processes of Force perception feel like trying to read a map in a storm. The light side and the dark side were both intensified, both closer to the surface and more immediately active than they were in any ordinary location, which meant that the internal landscape of a Force-sensitive person who entered a vergence was also unavoidably intensified. Their own capacities for both light and dark brought nearer to consciousness and made harder to manage with ordinary discipline. The Jedi had been finding these places throughout their long history. Some were already marked on maps when the earliest Order members arrived and began charting their known galaxy, locations that local populations had regarded as sacred or feared, or simply strange for so many generations that the original reason for the designation had dissolved into folk memory. Others were discovered by Jedi themselves, members who felt something unusual about a particular stretch of terrain or a specific depth beneath a planet's surface, and followed that feeling with enough patience and care to understand what they were encountering. Over thousands of years, the Order had accumulated a working knowledge of several significant vergences, their locations, and general characteristics, and the specific quality of what a person encountered upon entering them. Almost none of this knowledge was available to the ordinary member of the Order. It was not in the standard curriculum. It was not in the publicly accessible sections of the Jedi archives. It was not the kind of information transmitted from master to Padawan as a natural part of training unless the master in question had specific and unusual reasons for including it and the council had sanctioned that inclusion. What was known about vergences was held in the restricted archives and managed by the council with considerable care, for reasons that were legitimate in some dimensions and considerably more complicated in others. The legitimate reasons were straightforward. Vergences were genuinely dangerous, and sending unprepared, force-sensitive individuals into them could produce outcomes ranging from deep psychological destabilization to complete disconnection from ordinary reality. And the Order had a responsibility not to expose its members to that kind of risk without proper preparation and oversight. The more complicated reasons had to do with what the vergences actually showed the people who entered them and whether the Order was entirely comfortable with that. The most systematically studied vergence in the possession of the Jedi during the Republic era was not a dramatic location of ancient power or terrible darkness. It was a cave, a dark and cold and unremarkable-looking space on a small, fog-bound, swampy world in the outer rim called Dagobah. The cave sat beneath a particularly enormous and ancient tree at the edge of a region of the planet's surface where the dark side presence was unusually strong enough that a force-sensitive person standing outside the cave in the normal air of Dagobah could feel it as a weight, a pressure, a quality of attention being paid that had nothing to do with any visible or physical thing. Inside the cave, that feeling intensified into something that did not have a comfortable name in the vocabulary available to most Jedi who encountered it. The cave showed people themselves, not flattering versions, not the clean and carefully maintained self-understanding that any serious practitioner of a disciplined tradition naturally develops across years of training and meditation. It showed the part of a person they were least prepared to examine honestly, the shadow material, the fear and the rage and the hunger and the specific quality of darkness that was not general or archetypal but particular, individual, specifically theirs. What each person saw in that cave was different because what each person carried was different. What the cave did was the same for all of them. It brought that carried thing to the surface and placed it in front of them in a form they could not turn away from or intellectually manage from a safe distance. A young man named Luke Skywalker entered that cave during his training on Dagobah and saw Darth Vader. He attacked because the vision appeared to threaten him, and he had been trained to respond to threats with the capabilities available to him. He struck the apparition down, and the helmet of the fallen figure cracked to reveal Luke's own face beneath. Not Vader's face, Luke's. The cave was not telling him that he was Vader. It was telling him something more precise and considerably more uncomfortable than that. It was showing him that the darkness he was learning to fight was not external to himself, that the capacity for what Vader had become, the specific shape of shadow, that particular lineage and that particular force connection and that particular set of unresolved fears could produce, was inside him, present, real, requiring honest engagement, rather than the assumption that because he was a student of the light side, He was therefore immune to what the dark side could do with material like his. Yoda sent him in there knowing what he would find, or some version of it. Masters who understood the cave had used it for a specific purpose across the long history of the Order's presence on Dagobah. Not as a test in the ordinary sense of the word, not as a challenge to be passed or failed, but as a mirror. A place where you could see the thing you needed to understand about yourself that no amount of classroom instruction or council observation or careful master-to-Padawan conversation was going to show you, because it required a quality of direct confrontation that the regular channels of Jedi training had been organized in a way that consistently avoided. The Jedi's official position on dark side presence was that it was to be resisted. When you encountered it, whether in an adversary or an environment or within yourself, the appropriate response was to strengthen your connection to the light and hold the dark at arm's length. This was sound advice in many circumstances and genuinely useful guidance for students who were still developing the stability to navigate complex force encounters without losing their footing. But as a total philosophy, it had an important gap. Resisting something and understanding it are different activities. You can become extraordinarily skilled at the former without ever adequately addressing the latter. And the Jedi tradition, with its emphasis on maintaining clear boundaries between light and dark, and its institutional habit of treating the dark side primarily as an external threat to be guarded against, produced generations of practitioners who were technically very accomplished at resisting dark side influence, and considerably less accomplished at engaging honestly with the specific and particular ways in which darkness lived inside themselves as well as outside. The cave at Dagobah offered something the standard curriculum did not and could not: the confrontation that could not be avoided or managed or deflected through the application of better technique. The Order's restricted knowledge of vergences included extensive documentation of what various Jedi had seen and encountered in force-saturated locations across the galaxy, and the pattern that emerged from that documentation was consistent enough to be uncomfortable for an institution that had organized its entire training system around the proposition that the appropriate response to darkness was to push it away. What the Vergences consistently did was refuse that proposition. They brought the darkness near, made it immediate, made it personal, and asked the person encountering it to deal with it honestly, rather than at the practiced professional distance that Jedi training was very good at producing. There was a world the Order was aware of for a very long time before the fall of the Republic that operated on a scale that made the cave on Dagobah look modest. It was not a world in the ordinary navigational sense, not something that appeared reliably on standard charts, and could be reached through conventional hyperspace coordinates calculated by normal means. It existed outside of ordinary space-time in a way that the available scientific and philosophical frameworks could describe only in the language of paradox. The Jedi called it mortis, and it was the Vergence that the Council understood the least and discussed the most carefully when it was discussed at all, which was rarely and only among the most senior members of the Order. Mortis was the place where the Ones lived, where the father and his two children, the son who embodied the dark side in its living and sentient form, and the daughter who embodied the light, maintained their ancient and exhausting equilibrium. The entire world was a Vergence because the Force itself had become concrete there, had taken personal and individual form, had become beings with identities and histories and relationships, and specific desires and genuine suffering. The Force was not an impersonal energy field in Mortis. It was a family, It was something that had history and pain and love in it, and that had been holding itself in painful tension for longer than the Jedi Order had existed, maintaining a balance by the exercise of the Father's will that was perpetually on the verge of failing. What the Order knew about Mortis amounted to fragments, ancient references in texts older than most of the other texts in the restricted archives, mentions in traditions that the Jedi had encountered and documented without fully integrating into their understanding. They knew a place existed beyond ordinary space where the Force had taken living form. They knew it was extraordinarily dangerous in specific ways that had nothing to do with lightsaber combat or Sith aggression, and everything to do with the nature of the Force itself. They knew that entering it was not something that could be done by navigation in any conventional sense, but required something more like being called, required the Force itself to participate in the entry in a way that no master could simply will into existence by deciding to go. And they knew, or suspected, that what happened there had implications for the balance of the entire galaxy in ways that exceeded the ordinary scales of political or military power that dominated the Council's daily work. The Vergence at Malachor was different in quality from either Dagobah or Mortis, where Dagobah's dark side presence was cold and intimate and inward-turning, where Mortis existed outside ordinary reality in a domain defined by living Force entities of incomprehensible power. Malachor was the residue of catastrophe. The planet had been the site of a battle so enormous and so charged with dark side intensity that the devastation had not merely destroyed the surface of the world, but had permanently altered its relationship to the Force. The landscape was petrified. The bodies of those who had died there remained where they had fallen, frozen by the discharge of energy that had killed them, in configurations that preserved the precise moment of death across centuries. The dark side presence at Malachor was not a living thing or a concentration of something natural. It was a wound, a place where something terrible had happened, and the Force had not healed, and perhaps could not heal because the thing that had occurred was too large and too final to be absorbed. The Order kept these locations documented in the restricted archives because they understood, at least at the level of their senior membership, that Vergences were places where things could be learned that could not be learned anywhere else. The Force spoke differently in those places, more directly, more honestly, with less of the filtering that occurred when it moved through practitioners who had been trained to receive it in specific and carefully managed ways. The question the Order never fully answered was what to do with what the Vergences said. Because what they said, consistently and across many different individual encounters, documented across thousands of years of restricted records, was something the institutional framework found difficult to integrate. They said that the Force was not simply divided into a good side and a bad side, with the appropriate response being to cultivate one and reject the other. They said that the dark side was real and present and inside every person who could feel the Force at all, and that the appropriate response to this was not terror and resistance, but honest engagement. They said that balance was not the permanent triumph of the light over the dark, but an ongoing and active relationship between two things that were both genuinely real and both genuinely necessary. They said, in 100 different forms, across 100 different individual encounters, what the Jedi had said from the beginning, what the Jedi had decided after the Force Wars, was too dangerous to keep saying. The restricted archives held that documentation. Hundreds of accounts of Jedi who had entered Vergences and encountered the consistent reality that the Force was trying to communicate. The Order preserved those accounts because it was an institution that preserved things as a matter of principle, and because the senior members who maintained the restricted archives understood that even uncomfortable knowledge was better recorded than destroyed. But it did not substantially change its curriculum or its philosophical framework. In response to those accounts, because the gap between what the Virgenses said and what the Order had committed to teaching was too large to bridge without rebuilding the foundational philosophy from the ground up. And institutions do not do that. They manage the gap. They file the uncomfortable evidence in the restricted section and continue teaching the approved framework and trust that the distance between what they know in private and what they say in public will not eventually become unsustainable. It became unsustainable. But that is a different story, already told. The Sith were supposed to be extinct for 1,000 years before the Battle of Naboo. The official position of the Jedi Order was that the Sith had been destroyed, not driven back. Not merely defeated in the most recent engagement, destroyed. Ended as a living tradition, finished as an active presence in the galaxy. The Battle of Ruusan had accomplished what no previous conflict had managed. The Sith army had been annihilated. The Sith Lords, who commanded it, were gone. Everything that the Order understood about the Sith, the long and devastating history of their wars with the Republic, the cycles of conflict and recovery that had stretched across thousands of years, was over. A chapter had closed. The galaxy had moved on. The Jedi could direct their energy toward the many other challenges that remained and treat the Sith as a historical category rather than an active threat. This position was not simply a policy convenient for public communication. The senior members of the Order believed it. Yoda believed it, or believed something close enough to it that the distinction hardly mattered in practice. The Council had organized its entire understanding of the Force landscape of the galaxy around the premise that the dark side in its Sith expression had been neutralized as a living and directed force and would not return in that form without warning sufficient to permit response. This was not wishful thinking or the comfortable complacency of an institution that had grown too established to imagine genuine threat. It was based on genuine evidence and genuine reasoning. The Sith, as the Order knew them, had been a tradition maintained through specific social structures and specific techniques of transmission, master teaching apprentice, lineage passing knowledge forward across generations. Destroy enough masters and enough apprentices, eliminate enough of the living chain of transmission, and the tradition itself could not persist. This was the theory. The Battle of Ruusan appeared to have achieved its practical implementation. What the Jedi did not know was that one Sith had survived. One who had watched the destruction of everything he had ever known, watched the Sith army dissolve, and the Sith Lords fall, and the entire edifice of what the Brotherhood of Darkness had built collapse in a single devastating engagement, and who had drawn from that catastrophe not despair but clarity. His name was Darth Bane, and the conclusion he reached from the ruins of Ruusan was that the Sith had not failed because the Jedi were stronger. They had failed because of themselves, because of the way they organized power, because armies of competing Sith Lords inevitably spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting the enemy, because the multiplication of masters and the proliferation of practitioners diluted the dark side's concentrated force rather than amplifying it, because the entire structure of the Brotherhood of Darkness was philosophically incoherent and organizationally self-defeating and deserved to fail in exactly the way it had. Bane escaped the Battle of Ruusan. He took an apprentice. He implemented a new rule that governed everything that came afterward. 2 Sith. Only ever two, a master and an apprentice, one to hold the power and one to crave it. The rule of two was not merely an organizational decision made by a pragmatic survivor trying to preserve his tradition by downsizing it to a sustainable scale. It was a philosophical revolution in how the Sith understood their own purpose and their relationship to power. Concentration over proliferation, patience over aggression, secrecy over declaration. The Sith would not announce themselves. They would not build armies or establish empires or engage in the kind of large-scale, visible conflict that had always, eventually, brought enough Jedi force to bear to end them. They would wait. They would grow strong in the shadows. They would work through proxies and manipulation and the slow, careful application of intelligence across decades and centuries, and they would pick their moment with the patience of people who understood that the prize at the end was worth any amount of waiting. For 1,000 years, this worked with extraordinary effectiveness. The Jedi searched occasionally, in a general and unfocused way, for evidence of Sith survival. They found nothing they recognized as definitively Sith in nature. The dark side remained active in the galaxy, because the dark side was always active in the galaxy, and always would be. But the specific signature of Sith practice, of the dark side, used with the intentional and disciplined technique of a living tradition, did not appear in any clear or unambiguous form that the Order could point to and say with certainty that Sith activity had been identified. There are two possible explanations for this, and both of them are true simultaneously. The first is that Bane's plan was simply very good. The rule of two produced exactly the kind of hidden, patient, careful Sith tradition that the Jedi's monitoring capabilities were not equipped to detect, because those capabilities had been developed to find the kind of Sith presence that the Brotherhood of Darkness had represented. Numerous and active, and eventually willing to engage in open conflict. A single pair of practitioners operating in deep secrecy across 1,000 years of careful planning looked nothing like what the Jedi had trained themselves to notice. So they did not notice, and the plan advanced exactly as designed. The second explanation is that the Jedi were not looking as carefully as they could have been, and the reasons for that inadequate attention had less to do with the specific difficulty of detecting Sith activity than with the organizational and philosophical habits of an institution that had become very comfortable with the belief that its greatest enemy was finished. Institutions that believe a threat has been permanently neutralized develop a particular kind of blindness toward evidence suggesting otherwise. Not deliberate blindness, not a conscious choice to ignore. A trained and habitual orientation of attention away from the direction the evidence would need to come from. A set of assumptions so embedded in the normal operating framework that evidence which might challenge them is processed through that framework and comes out fitting it rather than challenging it. There were indications across the centuries between Ruusan and Naboo. Not dramatic revelations, not unmistakable Sith signatures, broadcasting their presence to any attentive observer. But things, patterns in political events that in retrospect look less like coincidence than like orchestration. Moments when the Force felt disturbed in ways that experienced practitioners noted and recorded, and then, because the disturbance did not fit the framework of Sith activity, and because the framework said the Sith were gone, interpreted as something else. Dark side practitioners who appeared on the galaxy's margins with levels of training and sophistication that exceeded what self-taught individuals normally achieved, implying the existence of a living teaching tradition that someone, somewhere, was maintaining. The council was aware of some of these things. They discussed some of them in their private deliberations. They did not connect them into a coherent picture that challenged the dominant assumption, because the dominant assumption was too central to too much of how they understood the galaxy to be easily dislodged. When Qui-Gon Jinn arrived before the High Council on Coruscant and told them that he had been attacked on Tatooine by a warrior who moved like a Sith and fought like a Sith and who had a lightsaber like a Sith, the Council's initial response was the response of people whose framework was not prepared for that information. It could not have been a Sith, they told him effectively, because the Sith were gone. It might have been a dark side user of some other kind, a fallen Jedi or a self-trained practitioner. But a Sith, an actual trained successor to the tradition that the Order had destroyed 1,000 years ago, was not a category the evidence was permitted to fall into without an extraordinary weight of confirmation that a single report from a single encounter could not provide. Yoda said it plainly. If truly he is a Sith, then this changes everything. And then they sent him away and discussed it among themselves. And the conclusion they reached was the careful and measured one of people maintaining their framework against pressure. They would proceed with caution. They would investigate. They would not declare that the Sith had returned on the basis of incomplete evidence, because declaring something like that incorrectly would cause exactly the kind of disruption and alarm that a measured and responsible institution should avoid. This caution was not irrational. Declaring the return of the Sith was not a small thing. It had profound implications for the Republic's political stability, for the relationship between the Jedi and the Senate, for the entire operating structure of an era that had been built on the premise that the defining darkness of the previous millennia had been permanently addressed. Getting that declaration wrong would cause serious damage. So the Council maintained its careful hedging and proceeded with its investigation. And when the truth became undeniable, when a Sith Lord killed one of their own in the generator rooms beneath Theed and left no ambiguity about what had just happened, the Order learned that the thing they had told themselves was finished had in fact been patiently waiting through their entire era of comfortable certainty and was now positioned better than it had ever been in any previous incarnation to accomplish exactly what it had been designed over 1,000 years to accomplish, what the restricted archives held, and what the Council had never fully confronted as a coherent picture was the documentation of all the moments when the signs had been available. Not individually conclusive, not any single one of them sufficient to override the framework, but assembled together, read as a series rather than as isolated incidents. They told a story that an institution less committed to its dominant assumption might have read differently. The gap between what the Order had known and what it had chosen to integrate into its active understanding was another version of the same pattern that appeared everywhere in the history of Jedi secrets. They preserved things. They kept the records. They did not always look at what the records were telling them, with enough honesty to let the telling land. The Jedi taught the Force. They taught the Force with extraordinary sophistication and depth, and across an enormous range of applications, from the fundamental skills of perception and physical manipulation that every student developed in their earliest years of training to the advanced and specialized capabilities that senior masters spent decades developing and refining. What they taught was genuinely impressive. No other institution in the galaxy came close to matching it in depth or consistency, or the degree to which its output, the generation after generation of capable and committed Force practitioners produced by the system, demonstrated real and reproducible competence. The Order was, as a training institution, among the most effective organizations that had ever existed. But there were things it did not teach. Not because they did not exist, not because the Order was unaware of them, but because a decision had been made at some point in the long history of the institution that these capabilities were either too dangerous to transmit to the general membership, or too inconsistent with the Order's philosophical framework, or too close to the dark side in their nature or their application to be part of what a Jedi was formally trained to do. These capabilities were documented in the restricted archives. Some of them were studied by individual masters who had the clearance and the intellectual curiosity to pursue them as subjects of research. Very few of them were transmissible through the normal training channels, and several had reached the point where the documentation was all that remained, because no living practitioner had exercised the capability with any regularity in generations. The ability called psychometry was among the less feared of these restricted capabilities, which is itself an interesting indicator of the range that existed. A Jedi with the ability to practice psychometry could, through physical contact with an object, perceive the Force impressions left by the people and events connected to that object. The most capable practitioners could experience what amounted to replays of significant moments associated with an item, could sense the emotional, and even, in some cases, the informational content of what had passed through the hands of people who had held it before them, could in rare cases use it to track individuals through the Force residue left in their belongings. It was an extraordinary investigative capability. It was also one that the Order treated with a considerable degree of caution, for reasons that were partly practical and partly philosophical. The practical reasons were that psychometry was disorienting in ways that required specific training to manage. An untrained or insufficiently experienced practitioner who touched an object associated with significant violence or dark side use could be overwhelmed by the impressions received, destabilized in ways that could produce lasting damage to their Force perception. Objects connected to Sith artifacts or dark side rituals were particularly dangerous in this regard, which meant the capability was most needed in exactly the situations where it was most risky to employ. The philosophical reasons were related to the Order's general discomfort with Force abilities that operated by immersion in residue, in the emotional and experiential echoes of the past, because those echoes did not discriminate between the Force expressions they carried, and a practitioner opening themselves to receive them was opening themselves to whatever was there, including darkness, including the specific emotional content of terrible things that had happened, including the possibility of being changed by prolonged or deep exposure to what they encountered. There were masters in the history of the Order who had used psychometry with great effectiveness and without apparent harm to themselves, but the formal teaching of it was restricted, and the general membership trained without it, and many Jedi who might have possessed the natural aptitude for it spent their entire careers without discovering this, because the curriculum did not include any component designed to identify or develop it. An ability called Morikro was more seriously restricted to the degree that by the final era of the Republic, it was known by name to only a handful of living Jedi and understood in practical terms by perhaps fewer than that. It was an extreme application of Force control over biological function, the capacity to dramatically slow the metabolic processes of another living being to a point approaching complete suspension of life activity, applied carefully and in full control. it could be used to place an injured person in a state of suspended animation and preserve them through conditions that would otherwise be fatal. Applied without complete control, it could kill. The line between suspended animation and death was not wide, and the level of sustained concentration and precision required to walk that line was extraordinary, even by the standards of advanced force practice. The Jedi Masters who had once taught it had argued, reasonably, that its medical applications justified the risk of maintaining it as a living technique within the Order. The Council had disagreed, or some version of the Council at some point in the intervening centuries had disagreed, because the capability had been placed in the restricted archives and the teaching of it had stopped, and by the time of the late Republic it had effectively ceased to exist as a transmissible skill. A few isolated practitioners had independently developed something like it through their own deep study. But those developments were personal and untransmitted, and would die with the practitioners who had discovered them. The capabilities in the restricted archives that drew the most careful management, the ones placed under the most layers of access restriction, and discussed the most cautiously among the senior members who knew they existed, were not the ones like psychometry or moricro that had primarily practical and medical applications that happened to carry risks. They were the ones that engaged directly with the dark side of the Force in ways that went beyond resistance or study and into something closer to active relationship. Abilities the Order had classified as dark side techniques, not because they were inherently and necessarily expressions of darkness in every conceivable application, but because the path to their development ran through engagement with dark side that the Order's philosophy forbade, and because their most notable historical applications had been by Sith and fallen Jedi, whose examples the Order was not eager to follow. Force drain was documented in detail in the restricted archives from accounts of encounters with Sith practitioners who had used it in combat. It was an ability that allowed a practitioner to draw Force energy directly from another living being, to consume the Force vitality of others as a source of power. In the accounts the Order had accumulated, it appeared most commonly as a combat application, a way of weakening opponents by drawing on their own Force connection as a power source for the practitioner using it. The most advanced applications described in the oldest accounts went further, capable of draining not just Force vitality but life itself, leaving targets diminished or dead. The Jedi preserved this documentation because they needed to understand what their adversaries were capable of. They had no interest in teaching it, because the development of it required a willingness to treat other living beings as sources of power to be consumed, which violated every principle the light side tradition held about the proper relationship between a Force user and the living Force around them. What the restricted archives also documented, in accounts that the Order had never quite resolved into its official narrative, was that the dark side techniques it classified as forbidden were not simply the inventions of evil people seeking power at any cost. Many of them had origins in traditions that had developed out of the same fundamental Force engagement the Jedi had practiced, had developed as one side of a coin whose other side was capabilities the Jedi used without hesitation, had begun as legitimate explorations of what the Force was capable of, that had only become associated primarily with darkness, because the tradition that might have held them in balance with their light side counterparts had been suppressed after the Force Wars. The dichotomy the Order maintained between the Force capabilities it taught and the ones it classified as dark side techniques was real in many of its specific applications. Real in the sense that certain capabilities produced effects consistently associated with harm and corruption and ought to be treated with serious caution. But it was also at its foundations, a product of the same original decision to reject Bogan entirely that had shaped everything else the Order had become. The dark side techniques in the restricted archives were the other half of the coin the Jedi had held whole. They were what Bogan looked like when it was developed by people who had no Ashlar tradition to balance it against. They were not simply the inventions of monsters. They were what happened to half a tradition when the half that might have held it in relationship was deliberately removed. The Order documented this. It did not fully follow the documentation to its conclusion. There are beings in the galaxy whose relationship to the Force is so deep, so total, so precisely aligned with the Force's most fundamental nature that they exist in a category that the usual vocabulary of Force practice cannot adequately describe. Not Force-sensitive, which implies a spectrum with insensitivity at one end and sensitivity at the other, because these beings are not on that spectrum in any meaningful sense. Not Force users, which implies an instrument and a practitioner wielding it, because the relationship these beings have with the Force is not one of wielding but of something closer to identity. They are the Force in a way that practitioners who merely use it cannot fully comprehend, and their understanding of the Force's nature and its entire history and its full purpose within the structure of galactic existence is consequently something that no amount of study by any individual Jedi, however gifted and however dedicated, could hope to match. The Jedi called them the Shaman of the Wills, and the honest answer to almost every specific question about what the Shaman of the Wills actually were and where they came from, and what the full extent of their knowledge encompassed, is that the records do not provide clean answers. The records are deliberately obscure in places, because the beings who might have provided clear answers had reasons for maintaining their obscurity, and because the Jedi's encounters with the Wills tradition across the long history of the Order had been rare enough and strange enough that the documentation that resulted was fragmentary in ways that preserved outline without filling in center. What is clear is that the Wills were not a new presence in the galaxy's Force history. They were not a tradition that emerged in response to any of the political and military developments that filled the Jedi's archives with battles and councils, and the names of specific practitioners whose choices shaped specific events. They predated all of that. Their relationship to the Force was older than the Jedi, older than any tradition of organized Force practice that the Jedi had ever encountered or studied, rooted in an engagement with the Force that went back to times the historical record could barely gesture toward, times when the galaxy was organized by forces and presences and structures of power that left only the most fragmentary traces in any evidence available to beings living in the Republic era. The Wills were, among other things, observers and recorders. This is perhaps their most practically significant characteristic from the perspective of anyone trying to understand what they knew and what they preserved. They watched across spans of time that exceeded any institutional memory available to the Order, across the entire sweep of galactic history, as it had unfolded from the earliest organized civilizations through the rise and fall of the Sith and the long middle chapters of the Republic and Jedi history. The Wills maintained a practice of careful and comprehensive observation, a recording of what occurred in the galaxy that was understood within their tradition as a sacred duty, a form of service to the Force itself, a recognition that the Force's own relationship to time and causality and the accumulated weight of what had happened in the galaxy depended on the existence of beings capable of holding and transmitting that record. The Journal of the Wills was the name the Jedi gave to the body of recorded knowledge the shaman maintained. Whether this was a single text or a tradition or a practice or all of these things simultaneously in forms, the Jedi's conceptual vocabulary could only approximately describe is not entirely clear from the documentation available. What the Jedi did understand was that the Wills possessed a record of galactic events that exceeded anything in the Jedi archives, both in temporal span and in the quality of understanding brought to what was recorded. The Jedi preserved facts and analyses and historical accounts. The Wills preserved something with more of the Force's own perspective in it. A record shaped not only by what had happened, but by what it meant in the deepest available sense. By what role the unfolding of galactic history played in the Force's own long movement towards something the Jedi could feel but not clearly see. Midichlorians, the microscopic organisms that lived within all living cells and that served as the material medium through which Force-sensitive beings perceived and engaged with the Force, were not simply biological organisms in the Wills tradition. They were communicants. They were the cellular-level mechanism through which the living Force was in continuous conversation with the beings it inhabited, through which the larger patterns and purposes of the Force were translated into a form accessible to individual biological consciousness, through which the Force's own awareness of what was occurring in the galaxy was continuously present in living beings who had the sensitivity to receive it. The midichlorians were, in the Wills' understanding, the biological expression of the Force's desire to know itself through the experience of individual consciousness. They were not a threshold that determined who got to use the Force and who did not. They were a relationship, a continuous and active and deeply personal relationship between the Force's most fundamental nature and every living being in the galaxy, capable of receiving what it was always trying to communicate. The Jedi understood midichlorians primarily as a measure, a count of units per cell that established where a being fell on the spectrum of Force sensitivity, and therefore roughly what their potential for Force practice might be. This understanding was not wrong in any direct sense. The correlation between midichlorian count and Force capability was real and documented, and served a genuine practical purpose in the Order's identification of candidates for training. But as an understanding of what midichlorians were, and what they did, and what the relationship they embodied meant, it was extraordinarily limited compared to what the Wills tradition held. The Jedi had taken something that the Wills understood as a living relational medium and treated it primarily as a metric. They had reduced a conversation to a measurement, and in doing so they had cut themselves off from an understanding of the Force's own active presence in living beings that would have changed fundamentally how they thought about training, about sensitivity, about what the Force actually wanted from the practitioners it inhabited. The Jedi had limited access to the Wills tradition across most of their history. Some knowledge had passed between the traditions in specific and often individual ways, through encounters between particular Jedi who had pushed far enough into their own understanding to reach the edges of what the approved curriculum acknowledged, and particular shaman who had judged that the exchange served the Force's purposes. The knowledge of Force immortality that Qui-Gon Jinn had begun to recover in his own personal study had threads that traced back to the Wills tradition in exactly this way, passed not through any formal channel, but through the kind of marginal and individual encounter that happens when someone is genuinely looking and genuinely open and has sufficient depth to recognize what they find when they find it. What the full body of Wills' knowledge contained, what the journal as a complete record held about the nature of the Force and the full history of the galaxy and the purposes the Force was working toward through the long unfolding of events that biological beings experienced as history, was not something the Jedi ever accessed in its entirety. The tradition maintained its boundaries, not out of hostility or a desire to keep the Jedi in the dark, but out of a recognition that certain knowledge requires a level of preparation and a depth of engagement that cannot be rushed, that the Force's own way of transmitting understanding is through the slow and patient and organic process of development, rather than through the transfer of information between parties at different levels of readiness. The Wills gave what could be received. What remained beyond the Jedi's reach was not withheld arbitrarily, but was simply beyond where the Order had reached in its own development. And the Order, in many of its institutional habits, had stopped developing in the directions that would have brought it nearer to what the Wills had always been trying to communicate. There is a planet in the Outer Rim called Dagobah. It is small and wet and largely unremarkable to any ordinary traveler who has no particular reason to stop there. The ecosystem is dense and alive, a continuous tangle of life forms in constant interaction with each other and with a Force presence that runs through the environment so thoroughly that it is difficult to say where the living things end and the Force begins. The planet does not appear prominently in any standard navigational database accessible to ordinary Republic citizens. It has no strategic importance, no mineral resources worth extracting at meaningful scale, no population centers, no history of occupation by any civilization with a presence the Republic's records would have noted. It is simply a wet and teeming world in the Outer Rim where almost nothing of obvious importance happens, and where the Force is more present than it is almost anywhere else in the accessible galaxy, and where an ancient master of extraordinary power and exhaustion chose to spend the last decades of his life. Yoda arrived on Dagobah after the fall of the Republic, with everything he had carried across 9 centuries of existence, and nothing that he had built during those centuries remaining to him. The Order was gone. The Temple was gone. The students he had trained and the colleagues he had worked alongside, and the institution to which he had given a full and genuinely devoted engagement across the entire span of his adult life, had been destroyed in a single night with a thoroughness that left almost no survivors. He had faced the Emperor himself and found that despite everything he was and everything he knew, and the full depth of his 900-year engagement with the Force, he could not defeat him. He had left that confrontation alive, and he had found a place to go, and he had been there, in the swamps of Dagobah, ever since. The isolation was necessary in the practical sense that the Empire was looking for surviving Jedi, and the Force presence on Dagobah was complex enough that the planet offered a genuine degree of protection against detection through Force perception. The dark side presence at the cave near Yoda's dwelling created a kind of interference, a static in the Force's clarity in that area, that made it harder to sense Yoda's specific and very distinctive signature against the background. This was not why he had chosen it. He had followed the Force to Dagobah in the way that practitioners who truly understood how to listen to it moved through the world, not with a rational calculation of available options, but with the kind of deeper attunement that simply knows where to go without being able to fully explain the knowing. And the Force had brought him to a place that turned out to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, as the Force's guidance usually did when someone was truly listening. What Yoda did on Dagobah in those years was not simply hiding. It was not simply waiting for the galaxy's situation to change enough that action became possible again. It was not even simply grieving, though there was certainly grief in it. The kind that comes when you have lived long enough and loved a thing deeply enough that its loss produces something beyond ordinary sorrow, produces a reckoning with everything you believed about what you were building and why, and whether the understanding you had brought to the project of your life was adequate to what the project actually required. He was studying. He was studying in the specific and sustained way that his position made uniquely possible, because the thing he was studying required exactly the conditions that his exile on Dagobah had created. He had no students to teach. He had no council to attend. He had no administrative responsibilities, and no political relationships, and no institutional structure placing demands on his time and attention. He had the Force, and the swamp, and the dark side presence in the cave, and the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn that he had begun to hear in the years following Geonosis, and that he had gradually learned to engage with more fully. He had everything he needed for the one kind of work that he had never, in all his centuries of remarkable activity, had the uninterrupted time to complete. What he learned there, what Qui-Gon's voice helped him toward, and what his own deep engagement with the Force in the absolute solitude of Dagobah made possible, was the completion of something Qui-Gon had begun before his death, and that Yoda had understood even as he watched the duel on Naboo in the final moments of Qui-Gon's life, that he might one day need the technique of conscious survival beyond death. The ability to return after the dissolution of the physical form, not as a haunting or a residue or an involuntary echo of what had been, but as a coherent and chosen and fully present engagement with the living Force from the other side of the boundary that biological consciousness normally treated as absolute. Yoda worked on this for years. The difficulty was not in the conceptual grasp of it. He had understood in broad terms what Qui-Gon had found, had followed the thread back through the Will's tradition far enough to know what the technique was aimed at and why it was achievable within the nature of the Force as he understood it. The difficulty was in the actual doing, because the doing required something that no amount of knowledge or conceptual clarity or 9 centuries of Force practice could simply produce by decision. It required a quality of surrender that was available only when everything else had been genuinely relinquished. Not surrendered formally. Not given up in the way that a person can officially renounce something while still internally maintaining a relationship with it. Actually surrendered. The thing that Yoda had spent his entire career within the Order building and maintaining and pouring himself into. His role, his students, his institution, his position at the center of the Force's organized engagement with the galaxy through the Jedi tradition, all of it was gone. Not taken from him in a way that left a longing or a bitterness or a continuing internal relationship with the loss. Gone in a way that, over years of sitting with it in the swamp, had become genuinely resolved. Not forgotten, not undone, but completed, finished in the way that something can be finished when you have lived long enough and thought deeply enough to reach the far side of grief and find the stillness that exists there. From that stillness, the technique became accessible, not easy, not something that happened overnight or even across the first few years of exile, but genuinely accessible in a way it had never been while he was still the Grand Master of the Jedi Order and the center of a living institution that required his continuing engagement. The Force asked for the whole of a person, and the whole became available only when there was nothing left being held back. Yoda arrived at that availability on Dagobah in the swamps, over years of solitude and grief and honest examination of everything he had done and everything he had failed to do and everything he had believed that turned out to be not quite right. When he had it, he passed it on. This is perhaps the most important thing Yoda did on Dagobah. Not the transmission of philosophy to Luke Skywalker during the few days of intense training that represent the visible record of his final period of teaching. The visible training was genuine and important and shaped everything that followed. But the deeper gift was invisible and had been prepared over years before Luke arrived on that planet. Because Yoda, who had spent his entire career within the Jedi tradition as its most senior and most capable practitioner, who had trained generations of students and carried more knowledge of the Force's nature than perhaps any living being in the galaxy's history, had also spent that career inside an institution that had limitations he now understood more clearly than he ever had during the years he was building and running it. He had seen, in the long perspective of exile, and the particular clarity that comes from having everything stripped away, the things the Order had buried, and the things it had forgotten, and the things it had misread, and the things it had protected itself from examining honestly by creating categories of restricted knowledge and approved frameworks that functioned as much to manage the discomfort of the institution as to serve the genuine development of its members. He had seen the Jedi secret at the foundation. He had understood, with the honesty that was only available from outside the institution rather than at its center, that the rejection of Bogan after the Force Wars had been a trauma response rather than a philosophical truth. He had seen the Chosen One prophecy in its original meaning and recognized what the Order had done to it across 1,000 years of interpretation through a lens ground by that original philosophical choice. He had seen the divergences and what they consistently said, and the gap between what they said and what the curriculum taught. He had seen the lost 20 and what their departures really represented. He had seen all of it, and what he had understood from seeing all of it was not that the Jedi had been wrong, not that the centuries and the tradition and the genuine wisdom and genuine service the Order had produced were simply errors to be discarded. He had understood something more nuanced and more honest and more genuinely useful to the person he was preparing to meet in the swamp. He had understood that what the Order had preserved was real and valuable and true as far as it went, and that what it had buried or suppressed or misread or allowed to drift out of reach was also real and valuable and true, and that the whole picture, the one that included both the tradition's genuine wisdom and its genuine blindness, was the foundation that whoever carried the Force forward would need to build on. Not the cleaned-up version, not the approved curriculum. The whole thing, with its contradictions held honestly and its failures acknowledged clearly, and its genuine magnificence intact, despite all of it. Luke Skywalker received something from Yoda on Dagobah that the entire Jedi Order at the height of its 10,000 years of institutional power had never been able to transmit, not because the Order lacked the knowledge, but because transmitting it required a degree of honest self-assessment that institutions, by their nature, resist. He received the techniques of Force practice that Yoda had spent a lifetime mastering. He received the history and the philosophy and the accumulated wisdom of a tradition that had been building itself for longer than most species in the galaxy had been flying starships. And he received, in the form of a small and exhausted and ancient being who had seen everything and lost everything and spent years in a swamp learning the difference between what the tradition said it was and what it had actually been, the truth. Not a comfortable version, not an edited one, the real thing. And then Yoda died, which is to say that Yoda completed the process he had been working on since his exile began and dissolved into the Force in the way that the technique he had recovered from Qui-Gon's fragmentary beginning made possible, and remained present in a form that could continue to serve and to teach and to be present across the boundary that the tradition had for most of its history treated as the absolute end. He had been the last surviving master of the Jedi Order. He was also the first to carry the complete picture forward, the one that included the secrets and the failures, and the original philosophy that had been buried, and the genuine wisdom that had accumulated in spite of the burial, and the two together that constituted something truer and more complete, and more genuinely useful to anyone who would try, in whatever form and by whatever means, to carry the Force's work forward in the galaxy that came after the Empire. There are things the Jedi never told anyone. Most of them, as it turns out, the Jedi had not fully told themselves. Not deliberately, not as a sustained and conscious deception maintained by people who knew the truth and chose to hide it, but in the way that truth gets lost in any institution old enough to outlive the people who last held it whole, in the way that memory gets shaped by what an organization needs to believe about itself in order to keep functioning, in the way that the most uncomfortable things have a way of drifting from the center to the edges and then out of reach entirely, leaving behind only the smooth and manageable version that nobody had to work too hard to maintain. The secrets were real. The Jedi tradition buried beneath the Order's official founding story, the archives that had been edited, and the entries that had never existed, and the things the Council knew privately that it did not transmit publicly. The 20 masters whose portraits hung on a wall while their actual arguments went unengaged. The prophecy read through the wrong lens for 1,000 years. The Force ghost technique lost and marginally recovered, and then lost again before it could be properly transmitted. The divergences and what they said, and the gap between what they said and what the curriculum taught. The Sith returning 1,000 years before anyone in the Order was willing to fully believe it. The forbidden techniques and the half-tradition they represented. The wills and the vastness of what they knew that the Order never reached. The final secret held by one small and ancient and exhausted being in a swamp about what the institution had been and what it had failed to be, and what it would need to become in whatever form it found in whatever came after. All of it was real. And all of it, in the end, survived. Not cleanly, not without enormous cost, not in the form the Order that produced it would have recognized or chosen. But the Force has a long memory, longer than any institution. And the things that were true remained true, even when the institution that might have transmitted them had stopped being able to hear them. What the Jedi buried had a way of coming back. What they forgot found its way to the people who needed it. What they lost was recovered in margins and solitudes and unexpected forms by people who were looking honestly and listening with genuine patience to the thing that had been trying to communicate clearly all along. The Force does not forget, even when everything built around it does. And somewhere in the quiet, in the space between sleeping and not sleeping, in the place where the accumulated weight of a long day begins to dissolve and the mind moves toward its own stillness, the Force remains. Patient, present, neither entirely light nor entirely dark. Both, always both. The way the oldest and wisest tradition in its history had understood it before the forgetting began. The way it will be again when what was buried long enough finally finds its way back to the surface. And that, perhaps, is the deepest secret of all. Not that the Jedi hid the truth, but that the truth was never truly hidden. It was there in every vergence they documented, and every portrait they preserved, and every student they sent into the dark side cave on Dagobah to find their own face staring back at them. It was there in the balance they claimed to seek, and the half they were afraid to hold. It was there in everything that was buried, and everything that was forgotten, and everything that drifted from the center to the edges, and waited, as such things do, for someone patient enough to look. Rest now. The galaxy is quieter than it was. The old wars are over. The secrets are spoken. What remains is the Force itself, which has been here longer than any of it, and will be here still when the last memory of every institution built around it has finally dissolved and gone, the way all things eventually dissolve and go, back into the living current from which they first arrived.